Well, I mentioned at the beginning of Mass that if you're paying attention to what's going on in this world, it's absolute disaster. The violence, the wars, the hatred, internationally, and even in our own Congress, where we are at a standstill. We can't even function because of division. And so I think our readings today do speak, offer us an opportunity to ask the question, who are we as Christians? And so, as I often do, I'd like to speak on three levels. One is the scriptures themselves. The second is the challenge that I see in the readings for us to really ask the question, where do I stand as a Christian in this world with so much hatred? And then finally, what can we do? So the scriptures. The first reading is from Isaiah, the original Isaiah, written in the 8th century before the Christian era. I'm sorry, the 6th century. This is not the original. This is a follower of Isaiah in the 6th century. And what's just happened is that the Jewish people who were held captive in Babylon have come back to Jerusalem. And they've come back because of a king, a pagan king. The Persians have overthrown the Babylonians, and Cyrus is the Persian king. And he decrees that he wants all the Jewish people to go back to their homeland. He even pays for some of the restoration of the temple. He returns a lot of the gold chalices or whatever was in the temple to the people. It's really unheard of. And so the Jewish people come back. They build the temple and they start life anew. But how did it happen? It didn't happen through the work of the Jewish people. It happened through the grace of God. And what Isaiah is telling the Jewish people is, this pagan king has been used by God to do good. Something that would be incomprehensible probably at the time to really understand, and maybe even today. But I think the lesson to be learned is that God works sometimes in ways that we do not understand. That there's challenges, perhaps, in the way God works that are contrary to what we would expect and really move us off our sense of righteousness, our sense of stability, and ask us to re-examine where we are. In our second reading, I'll mention briefly, Paul is writing to the Thessalonians in about the year 50, 52. So 20 years or so after Jesus has been killed, and we believe as Christians raised from the dead. The Thessalonian community is the second community that Paul has founded in Europe. And he's left that now, and he's writing, this is an introductory comment to his letter. And he's really thanking the Thessalonian people for continuing to live as he instructed them, to live the way of Jesus in this world despite the hatred that may be shown towards them for following the so-called way. And in our gospel reading today, we've heard many times, there's an attempt by the Pharisees and the Herodians. The Pharisees were law-abiding Jews who were well-liked by the people. They were very scrupulous about maintaining Jewish custom, ritual, and law. The Herodians agreed with them on all that, with the one exception, that the Herodians were looking for Herod Antipas to come back into power in Jerusalem. When Herod the Great died, his kingdom of Israel was divided up into 3 kingdoms of his 3 sons. Herod Antipas wound up with the area of Galilee, which was not as significant as Jerusalem. The Herodians were looking for a time when Herod Antipas might be able to come back into power in Jerusalem and Judea. But they were aligned with their religious beliefs, the two of them. And what's going on here is there's an attempt to entrap Jesus in a no-win situation. He's shown the coin. If he says he give the coin to Caesar, he could be accused of aligning himself with Roman authority, which would have been a horror to the Jewish people. If he gave the coin or took the coin and really said that basically he said we should revolt against the coin and not pay our taxes, he would have the support of the Jewish people, but he would not have the support of Rome. And it would put him in a situation that could be fairly precarious. But the answer here really shows something about Jesus. Jesus was human and divine. But we see in his ability here, this is a man who's capable. Jesus' education would have been nothing like the Pharisees. They were, by today's standards, they were educated at Harvard. They knew the law. Jesus was educated at a community college up in Galilee. And yet we see this is a man who's smarter and more clever than anyone who's really questioning him. And what he's really telling people is, you have concerns about things of this world. He says, my concern is much more beyond that. It's to who God is, to my relationship with God and my desire to do God's will, and to express and to show this kingdom of God, a world where there is love for all God's people, where there is compassion at the sight of human suffering, and where there is a justice that knows no bounds, regardless of race, religion, the color of one's skin, one's sexual identity. God created all, and God desires the salvation of each and every one of us. And so I think it leads to the question of, it's an opportunity, I think, these readings to say, Jesus saw the world in a different way than humanity does, where there's one of vengeance, where there's one of hatred, where there's a desire to control other people's lives. God doesn't see it that way. The God of Jesus is a God who desires that everybody is given human respect and human dignity. It does not matter what country they come from, what their beliefs are. This God desires that all people live with human dignity and human rights. As I mentioned at the beginning of Mass, in the past week or so, I've had a number of people approach me, and this common word is one of great sadness. People recognize this is not the way the world should be working. The violence that has been unleashed, the thousands of people that have been killed in the past 2 weeks. Numbers I've read, perhaps I don't have the latest, but 150,000 in Israel, 250,000 in Palestine. What Hamas did to Israel is condemnable. But on the other hand, what Israel is doing now to Gaza and the Palestinian people, in my judgment, is equally condemnable. This kind of violence should not happen. As Christians, we're called to be peacemakers and to sow peace in this world, and to ask that the violence stop. When will we learn that violence only begets violence, and that wars sow the seeds upon the vanquished of injustice and future violence down the road? That's what's going on right now. One side will win, one side will lose, and vengeance will return. Jesus died on a cross forgiving people who mistreated him. As Christians, we're called to do no less, to ask for talking, for negotiation, and to stop the violence. And so our Pope, Francis, has talked about, especially in the first world where we live, the globalization of indifference that many of us, myself included at times, we live apart from a lot of the violence that's going on in this world. And as a result, we don't emotionally plug into it, although in fairness, many have. And what Pope Francis is really asking for is what he calls global solidarity. I mentioned at the beginning of Mass, someone said, where is God in all of what's happening? And the answer is, God is in the midst of human suffering. God is there in Gaza. God is there in Israel. God is there in the Ukraine. And we're called to somehow participate. We're not there. We can't do what other people may be doing. But we can raise our voices and say, enough violence. Enough is enough. This is not the way to live as human beings. And when people rise up and force their leaders to back off and go to a negotiating table, the people have won. So what can we do? Everyone makes their own decisions. The Catholic Church has a wonderful way of looking at the world with its Catholic social teaching. It has been called the best-kept secret of the Catholic Church. Many people know very little about it. And yet, over the ages, what has happened is the Catholic Church has spoken repeatedly for the human rights and the human dignity of all people, regardless of where they are in this world and what their religious beliefs are or their political system. The Catholic Church traditionally has offered one way of looking at war or the response to war, and since Vatican II has really begun to champion a separate way. The first way is called the just war theory. It began from a Christian perspective in the time of Augustine in the 4th century. It was, how do you respond? Or is there the possibility of a response to aggression by one nation upon another? When can you justify a response of violence? And the church has said traditionally there is a justification if it meets 4 criteria. One is that the initial aggression of the person who has started this, or the nation, is that the damage done to others is grave and severe and lasting. The second is that all attempts at negotiation or peace building have proved fruitless. The third is that there is a reasonable chance of success by the opposition intervening. And the fourth is that the violence that will be perpetrated in response is proportionate to the violence that has already occurred, meaning that the disproportionate show of violence, where there is an excessive use of violence over and above what has already occurred, the church says is unjustified because of the loss of innocent civilian life. And we may all decide for ourselves if you think this current goings-on is justified. But I know in 1986, the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops introduced the idea that given war in our current age, with the lethality of war, atomic weapons, and the disasters that can be perpetrated on other people, innocent civilians, makes the justification of any type of war very difficult to justify. And yet we find around the world that many people just go ahead. Nations respond, protecting their own interests, not thinking of the civilians involved. The civilian loss of life in the past 2 weeks in this world is astronomical. It's hundreds of thousands of people. We can only imagine ourselves if we lived in Israel or Gaza and we lost family members. Why? Because of violence, because of greed, because of the desire to dominate one over the other. I'm not taking sides in this. I'm condemning both sides. The violence must stop. The second way of looking at this came around Vatican II. I think most people who would be my age or older, in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Catholics who pleaded conscientious objection were not accepted by the government. They said, your religion justifies war under certain conditions. You can't plead conscientious objection. But in Vatican II came this idea that a response of no violence to war, but asking for peace and settlement, negotiation, became more and more acceptable. And today, it is something that the Catholic Church recognizes as a valid way of proceeding. And so we're left with a choice. Can you justify by the just world theory the response that is going on today, as evil as the first response was? Or can you take a second course that is based basically in the life of Jesus? Just war theory has nothing to do biblically with Jesus. It is a rational approach to the world in which we live in. The idea of nonviolence that has come out of the Second Vatican Council and the U.S. Conference of Bishops in 1986 says the life of Jesus says otherwise, that the response to violence is not violence. It is love and peace-seeking. I run an organization called A Faith That Does Justice. We have 2 missions. One is to raise consciousness about social issues that are affecting people today. The wars that are going on, the violence that has been unleashed, our own Congress that does not function. And saying violence will only breed more violence. War is not the solution. That we need to talk. We need to negotiate. We need to find ways of living together, because God created all and God desires the salvation of all. And so, I ask again, when will we ever learn that war is not the answer? And that the victor in these types of situations sow the seeds of further violence down the road. It's an unending cycle. Violence brings only more violence. Let us ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a Christian today? Is it just ritual, and is it just dogmatic belief? To be a Christian, we have to have certain beliefs, and we're proud of them. We believe Jesus is human and divine. We believe in the resurrection of Jesus. We believe in a Trinitarian God. But Jesus did more. He acted in this world, incarnating God's love for all people. He had compassion at the sight of human suffering, and he acted. He acted to alleviate suffering on the one hand, and the other is he spoke truth to power. It is the latter that got him killed. And so I think what we can do, something to reflect on during the week, is if we want to live as Christians as Jesus lived in this world, there are two things we can do. One is to incarnate God's love where we are, in the small world in which we live, offering God's compassion to people who are suffering, wherever that may be, within our families, within this church congregation, or within our wider network of friends and family. And the second thing we can do is to speak truth, that war is not the answer, and violence only begets more violence.